Hello everyone! With the Genshin 5.2 beta releasing, everyone is excited about the kits of both Chasca and Ororon. However, we've recently learned that HOYOverse is deciding to buff some of the reactions in patch 5.2. Specifically, they are buffing Superconduct, Shatter, Overload, and Electro-Charged. And this is very reminiscent to when, in patch 1.6, HOYOverse decided to buff some of the scalings of some transformative reactions with EM, which made animal units and Swirl much more powerful. And these newest reaction changes may just also be as meta-breaking as what happened in 1.6. So I wanted to quickly cover and analyze what the reaction changes are, and how much better the reactions are now in the meta with the buffs. So what did HOYOverse decide to change with the reactions? For Superconduct, Shatter, Electro-Charged, and Overload, HOYOverse is deciding to increase the reaction multipliers of all of those reactions. For Superconduct, it's going from 0.5 to 1.5, Shatter 1.5 to 3, Electro-Charge 1.2 to 2, and Overload 2 to 2.75. Now what does this actually mean? Now in order to understand this, I think it's good to take a look at the reaction multiplier equation. I know not everyone is interested in numbers, but the main thing I want to emphasize is that the reaction multiplier, which is the first thing into the equation, that is the number that HOYOverse is changing and buffing, and typically you just put a number in there and then you multiply with the other numbers, which for our current purposes we don't have to worry about. So for example, if we wanted to calculate a superconduct reaction pre-buff, we would just put 0.5 into the equation and then multiply everything else by 0.5. If we were to calculate the damage of a superconduct reaction post-buff, we would multiply everything else by 1.5 instead of 0.5. I put the numbers into chart form to visualize how much damage you gain from each reaction from the buffs, assuming your character is at level 90 and assuming you either have 0 EM or 1000 EM, because these transformative reactions scale off EM. I put the same scaling on both of these charts just to visualize that with more EM, the more damage you gain from the buff. But obviously you're not going to build everyone with 1000 EM. This is just a visualization of, oh, you get more gains as you build EM, making EM a bit more strong. So a general buff for these reactions is pretty nice, especially for the reactions that aren't very used that much. But next I wanted to focus on specifically each reaction to see how this buff actually changes the strength of teams that revolve around the reaction and the overall meta in general, because this buff can be pretty insignificant for some reactions but very significant for some other reactions. First, let's cover Superconduct. Superconduct got the highest reaction damage multiplier increase out of all the reactions, so it did get a nice buff in damage. However, I don't think this buff is very significant, mainly due that even if you buff the Superconduct reaction, it doesn't magically make the units that can take advantage of Superconduct better. Usually teams that take advantage of Superconduct take advantage of the physical res decrease that Superconduct provides, for example, physical DPSs like Eula. And unfortunately, even if you increase the Superconduct damage, it's not going to magically make Eula teams any better. These teams have other problems that need to be dealt with, such as maybe introducing new characters that are just stronger, or new artifact sets and weapons that can buff up their numbers. Just increasing Superconduct reaction damage isn't going to do much. It might be interesting to see some teams that just solely rely on Superconduct and just forget about the physical, you just put cryo and electro units together. But again, sure, the damage of the reaction has increased, but then you're just putting electro and cryo characters together in a team, which may not be the best because some of the cryo characters you can use aren't that good. And in order to take advantage of the Superconduct damage, you're going to have to build EM on your electro and cryo characters, which I don't think is going to be that optimal. So I don't think this Superconduct buff is going to change too much, but it is a nice buff for a reaction that really isn't used that much. The same type of logic goes with Shatter. Shatter has also gained a relatively large increase because its reaction multiplier of 3 does match some of the highest reaction multipliers of other transformative reactions like Hyper Bloom. But even if Shatter can deal a lot of damage, just like Superconduct, I don't think building EM on your Shatter trigger is going to be that good. In addition, it's very hard to trigger a lot of Shatters, and same with Superconduct, some of the units that want to synergize with Shatter aren't that good. The only one really is Fremine, and sure, he gets a decently nice buff, but again, you won't be triggering Shatter that much, and just the increase in an individual reaction damage when it doesn't even incur that much for Fremine isn't going to magically make him insanely good. Shatter still has its issues with limited teammates, but again, it is a very niche reaction, so it is nice to see that HOYOverse is buffing these less used reactions. Now, the most interesting thing about buffing Superconduct and Shatter is that it may indicate that HOYOverse is deciding to do more with these reactions in the near future. For example, we know that Citlali is going to be a cryo character, and the prevailing thought is that she will be released in 5.3, the patch after Chasca and Ororon alongside potentially Mavuika. So these Superconduct and Shatter buffs could be in preparation for Citlali's release. And with a new cryo character that may synergize very well with these reactions, that may be enough to push Superconduct or Shatter into a very strong state. But we'll just have to see in the future, because currently I don't think it does too much, but again, it might be in preparation for the future. The other two reactions are currently more meta, so the buffs do make more of a difference. First, let's discuss about Overload. Now, the main reason why Overload is meta is pretty much because of Chevreuse. Chevreuse's buffs has made Overload teams pretty strong, especially for main DPSs like Arlecchino, Cloran, and Raiden. So a buff to Overload pretty much means a buff for these teams, which is pretty nice. However, this isn't too big of a buff, because even though these teams are quite strong with Chevreuse, so a buff to Overload seems to be, oh, you're buffing good teams. The thing about these teams is that the teams don't rely on the Overload reaction for their damage. You typically rely on Chevreuse's buff to just buff the raw damage of main carries like Arlecchino, Cloran, and Raiden. You're not going to be building EM on these characters just to trigger larger overloads. As a result, overloads don't make up that much of the team's damage. Thus, the Overload buff is nice for these teams, but it isn't too significant. It does make building EM a bit more favorable for the characters triggering Overload, and some examples of these are Fischl and Xiangling. Animal characters that can also trigger overloads from their squirrels do also benefit because they're actually building EM, so they can trigger even larger overloads. And lastly, Electro-Charged. Now, even though the reaction multiplier was only increased from 1.2 to 2, Electro-Charge is a little bit weird in the sense that if you trigger one Electro-Charge, it doesn't actually just proc once, it kind of procs twice. So you can actually treat the reaction multiplier to be increased from 1.2 to around 3. So when you take into account the multi-hit of Electro-Charge, the buff is actually quite significant. If we talk about just pure Electro-Charge with just Hydro and Electro units, these types of teams did kind of work, but they were a little bit on the lower side in terms of damage. So the increase in the multiplier of Electro-Charge does help these teams. And these Electro-Charge buffs are made even stronger with the introduction of Ororon, who is looking like an Electro sub DPS that synergizes very well with Electro-Charge, providing both damage and buffs to the team. So just combining the Electro-Charge reaction buff with the introduction of Ororon, just fitting in an Electro-Charged core into teams may be pretty strong for some units. For example, a Chasca team revolving around Electro-Charge could be one of her better teams. Now, the main winner of these Electro-Charge buffs, which I kind of mentioned in the Overload section, are Anemo units. Taser teams, typically driven by Sucrose, have been popular since pretty much the beginning of Genshin, and these teams have remained pretty strong throughout the game's lifespan. So obviously buffing Electro-Charge buffs these teams pretty well, and the main reason is because usually the Anemo character builds a lot of EM, and as I showed from the charts before, having more EM with this reaction buff increases the damage by much more compared to a character that has 0 EM. So if you can imagine your full EM Anemo character like Sucrose or Cosmo just constantly triggering Electro-Charges from swirling Hydro and Electro, you can imagine that they're going to be doing a lot of damage. And like I said, this idea is kind of similar in the Overload sense, but with Electro-Charge, you're going to be triggering the Electro-Charge reaction way more often. So I wouldn't be surprised if some upcoming new top teams revolve around Electro-Charge, the introduction of Ororon, and Anemo units with EM just triggering constant Electro-Charges. So that's everything I wanted to cover and analyze about these new reaction buffs. Just to summarize my thoughts, Superconduct and Shatter, even though they were buffed, they didn't gain too much because those teams just aren't that good in general at the moment. But the Overload buffs are pretty nice for existing Chevreuse Overload teams, and the Electro-Charge buffs are pretty strong, especially for Anemo units building full EM, constantly triggering Electro-Charges, and the introduction of Ororon. Overall, I'm glad that HOYOVerse is deciding to buff these less used reactions. Superconduct and Shatter are pretty much forgotten in most teams, so it's nice that HOYOVerse is giving them some love, and even Electro-Charged and Overload, you could argue, are kind of less common, especially when you consider that a lot of the top meta teams typically include characters like Bennett, Xiangling, and Farina, so they're all revolved around Pyro and Hydro and Vaping. So by introducing buffs to these lesser used reactions like Electro-Charged and Overload, they're pretty much closing the gap between the teams that just rely on Pyro, Hydro, and Vaping with some teams that you don't see too often like Electro-Charged and Overload. And with more introductions to newer characters that can synergize with these lesser used reactions, they might improve these teams even more and more, giving these teams an even better place in the meta and competing with existing top teams. And that way we just have more team options, because I don't think everyone wants to use Farina, Bennett, and Xiangling for every single character. Hopefully this reaction analysis was helpful to y'all. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, a comment, subscribe to the channel, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.